This class is concerned with human resource planning. Human resource planning, HRP, is based on efficient employment planning. The concept of HRP is focused on predicting employee supply and demand. So it's recruiting enough workers to enable the business to function efficiently. But it's recruiting workers and ensuring that the workers are in supply. So there is a supply and demand relationship for appropriate workers. In order for the organization to reach its aims and objectives, there must be the right number of various skilled employees doing the right work at the right time. So we have a rather complex expression. We have the idea of the organization requiring employees from the stock of employees or potential employees in the labor market. The organization acquires the appropriate number, but they have to have the right skills, and they have to be capable of undertaking the tasks required of them, and they should be able to undertake these tasks at the right time. Effective human resource planning involves the smooth flow of employees into, through, and out of the organization. We could say it's a flow concept. The employees are flowing into the organization, they're moving through it over the course of their employment with the organization, and they flow out at the end and either retire or go on to different occupations or similar occupations elsewhere. Now, the importance of human resource planning. Well, human resource planning takes care of employee entry, so it's involved in the recruitment process, in determining how many employees are required and identifying the shortfalls in labour within the business and what is required in the marketplace. It also looks at the development of the labour force, development to ensure that they've got the skills and their skills are constantly updated to meet the evolving pressures of the business, perhaps technological pressures, new machinery requiring new techniques and so on. So the HRP section must ensure that the training is appropriate. And finally, it looks after people leaving the business. It conducts the exit interview and determines why the person is leaving and what went right and what went wrong, and gets an account of what the person leaving feels about the organization and what improvements can be made. HRP is the responsibility of all managers within the organization, not just the human resource department. Really, it's for all managers to make recommendations as for, let's say, training. When a manager sees the employees working for him or her, sees those employees struggling, then it should be obvious that they need skills updating, they need improvement, they need training. So the recommendation can come from any department, not just the human resource department. The main focus of human resource planning is looking at the labour demand, how many employees are needed in the organisation, looking at the workflow in the company, looking at the way the work is started, processed and completed. Are there any gaps in the workflow? Are the right number of people engaged? Or is there a vacancy for someone to do a particular function which would further increase efficiency? But it also looks at the labour supply. How many qualified employees are available to the organisation to effectively meet the company's requirements? what's the labour force like? What's the labour market like? Is there a skill shortage in the labour market? There's long-term and short-term needs. The organisations may consider laying off their human resources due to economic considerations. For example, when the market turns against the product, they may be tempted to lay off the workforce. Now, human resource planning needs to be involved to determine whether this is a good decision or not. Management will need to determine the value of their human resources and their capabilities. Having carefully trained workers and perhaps developed in-house training programs or sent the workers on expensive training programs elsewhere, to just lay them off is a big decision. The company needs to be sure that the downturn is permanent before layoffs take place. Laying off employees in the short term could result in more training costs when employing them in the future. So if the downturn is temporary and workers are laid off, when the company picks up, the workers may not be available. They may have gone to other companies, or they may have left the labour force. Managers need to consider whether laying off their human resources in the short term would affect them in the long term. So it's important to distinguish short and long term influences before making decisions about layoffs or about decisions which will affect the number of employees and the quality of the employees and the morale of the employees also, the motivation and the morale, because that will be affected by talk of layoffs. Environmental influences on human resources. As part of human resource planning, it's vital that the organisation scans its internal and external environment. It should conduct a PEST, politics, economic, social and technological review of its resources, or a SWOT, a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats analysis. It should be aware of what are the strengths of the workforce, what are the weaknesses, what opportunities do they present, what's the threat from the workforce in terms of perhaps they will want to leave or they want higher salaries, or it's important to have a good fix on what is going on in the workplace. And also look at the external environment. Look at what's happening in the labour market. Look what's happening in the economy. Is unemployment rising? What's happening to the rate of inflation? Are people feeling worse off or better off? Also looking at the throughput from colleges and universities and from schools. What's the quality of the labour force? And how well equipped are the labour force to compete internationally? So there are economic considerations to take into account, but also social influences. People may not want to work long hours or may not want to work in dirty occupations as they see them. They see the organisation as dirty, as noisy, as polluted. They may not want to work there. So there may be social implications or social influences determining employment in a given sector. And also demographic factors. What percentage of the population, perhaps the local population, which go to make up the labour market, what percentage of them are in retirement age or are in their 40s? What percentage of them would be willing to take on training? What percentage of them have skills or have employment histories? There are also technological factors. Technology does not stand still, and more workers are expected to have technical skills. Working in an office will require knowledge of computer packages. Working in accounts will require detailed knowledge of how to use spreadsheets and how to use dedicated accounting packages. It depends on the size of the company, of course, but by and large, that's the way the world is. So the workforce need to have these skills, and it's the function of the human resource planning section to recruit people, to recruit workers who have the appropriate skills. Now this means forecasting the human resource requirements. So looking at the demand for human resources. What determines the demand? Well, what determines the demand is the state of technology. The technology may be labour saving or becoming labour saving. Machines may be more automated. And that may be more dehumanizing because the worker feels less involved in the final product. They don't have the same pride that they did before when they made the product from start to finish. Now the machines are making it, and the machines are perhaps making it to a better quality than in the past, a more consistent quality. So why is the demand for human resources? And how does the company go about getting external human resources? Through recruitment fairs, through agents, through advertisements in the press. It's expensive, and it's also hit and miss, because unless the company know that the skills are out there, then this is a waste of money. Unless they know there are people suitable that simply need to be contacted, then it is a waste of money. It's a waste of taking space in advertising and employing agents. So the company must have some knowledge of what is happening in the labour market, and it requires specialists to keep their proverbial ears to the ground to see what is happening. There is an internal supply of human resources, and it's important that the people who are working for the business are given every opportunity to develop, go on training programs, have a more interesting occupation, so they become more committed, and there's greater labour retention as a consequence. They can empathise with the objectives of the business, and they are developing with the business. Forecasting allows organisations to prepare for future events, but forecasting is a strange activity. It involves looking into the future, and we can't tell what the future is truly like until it happens. So forecasting is a hit and miss affair. Forecasts for labour could be based on all sorts of variables. The business objectives, for example, the mission of the business. Does it want to be big or small, or what sort of product does it want to make, and where does it want to be located, and is it a green business, or so what's the mission? It needs to involve what sales the business anticipates, how many units will be produced, or what will be the throughput of the business. It needs to look at the employee skills and capabilities. How productive are the workers, and how can they also collaborate with the machinery given the technical changes and the economic changes that are running through the industrial fabric. So forecasting the human resource requirements is extremely complex. Having said that, there are approaches to forecasting that we should be aware of. Essentially there are two, quantitative and qualitative, two approaches. Just very briefly have a look at these. Start with the quantitative. Now the quantitative looks at people as numbers, so it's very dehumanizing. It's nothing to do with personalities or anything of that nature. It simply looks at employees as numbers. And they're grouped under certain categories. For example, so many male, so many female, so many aged 20 to 30 and aged 30 to 40 and so on. What skills have they got, and their performance levels, and what are their qualifications. So it's looking at numbers. It's looking at how many people have got a degree, how many people have got an engineering degree, how many people are qualified accountants, how many people can use a milling machine or a lathe. So it's looking at the skills and the qualifications of people. And based on statistical data in order to predict the outcome. So it tries to work out from statistics if the people will be available in the labour market when required. So the management will look at the findings, and these findings, if it's a small company, may be published by the government or it may be published by other agencies. It'll look at what's available in the labour market, and it'll try to calculate or get a rough estimate of whether the employees will be available when they're required and what skills and competencies and qualifications they'll have. The quantitative approach, well, it uses forecasting methods. So the government may, or the universities, or whoever's doing the calculations may use forecasting methods. And these can be expensive to administer and may require specialist skills. And not everybody can do it. So small companies may not find it useful to engage in this activity. Perhaps big companies can. But essentially, what it's doing is using very sophisticated techniques to try and extrapolate, try to work out where the trend will be in the future. Will there be more bricklayers in the future or less? Will there be more accountants in the future or less? So it's trying to look forward and trying to predict. Types include trend projection. Trend projection is trying to make predictions that are based on past trends, which determine future events or are seen to determine future events. For example, sales and profit turnover. So let's say in the past the wages for bricklayers was rising very rapidly. That may be an indication of a shortage of bricklayers. And they would then use that calculation to try and predict whether more bricklayers will come forward, because more people will be attracted by the higher wages. And there's also something called econometric modelling, which is a very advanced form of statistical analysis, normally using quite advanced computer algorithms and procedures. And it looks at probabilities and makes assumptions, and it has got a very specialist model that it uses. Again, this is the province for governments, research agencies and specialists. But small companies can get access to this, perhaps through the local Chamber of Commerce or through the Institute of Directors, or by reading specialist journals for management in the area. And specialists in the human resource planning field will know all too well about where there are good sources of information on skill shortages and what's been done to redress these and the implications of them. So it's a question of keeping up to date. The qualitative approach uses expert opinion from managers to forecast the future. It's qualitative. It's not quantitative. It's not counting up. It's looking at the ideas of managers and experts and taking their views into account. So it's more literal. It's talking to people, asking them what they think is going to happen and trying to work out from that. Management discuss employee performance and whether there is a possibility of promotion or career development. So the management may make estimates about shortages and may look at problems within the organisation in terms of filling specific roles, looking at promotion of existing perhaps workers into areas of responsibility which will leave a vacancy further down, and can that be filled from the labour market. This approach is not, the qualitative approach I should say, is not as consistent as the quantitative approach. The quantitative approach has many criticisms based on assumptions and probabilities and interpretations of the data and the model used and so on. So there are criticisms of the quantitative, but the qualitative, well, you can have differences of opinion, many differences of opinion based on the views of the individuals who are being interviewed or the statements that they make. So overall, the human resource planning field is extremely important because it's trying to get a view as to what resources are available and how can the company best recruit appropriate employees to fill any gaps and to identify the gaps that are in the company in terms of its production processes and its operational processes. That's all I'm going to do on this topic. I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.